The last truth: Lucia Mendoza had not returned to San Cristobal in 19 years, but when she received the hospital call that early morning, she felt time stop completely, as if the world had momentarily frozen around her. Her mother was in a coma. The doctors didn't know if she would wake, didn't know if consciousness would ever return to her eyes. Without thinking, without hesitation, without even considering the consequences for her carefully constructed life in Mexico City, she closed her law office, canceled every appointment, postponed every case, packed a single suitcase with the bare essentials, and boarded the first available flight. The case files remained on her desk, gathering dust. The clients who had relied on her fierce representation would have to find other counsel. Nothing mattered anymore except getting home. During the entire flight, which felt like it lasted both minutes and eternities, Lucia remained motionless in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests. So tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared out the window at the clouds passing beneath her feet, watching the landscape gradually change from the sprawling urban chaos of Mexico City to the more rural terrain of her childhood state. Her mind, however, was traveling backward through time, journeying through the years and decades to that single night that had fractured her family like porcelain dropped on stone. That night that had changed everything, that had set her on the path that led her away from San Cristobal and into a life of law, justice, and a particular kind of vengeance. She was 12 years old when it happened. 12 years old in that peculiar age between childhood and adolescence, where you still believe the world makes sense, where you trust that authority figures tell the truth, where you don't yet understand the darker complexities of human nature. That was the night her father, Hector Mendoza, disappeared without a trace. One moment he was there, a presence in her life, someone who tucked her into bed and told her stories, someone whose laugh echoed through their small house. And the next moment, he was simply gone, erased from the world as if he had never existed at all. The local police, under the direction of the then-young Commissioner Javier Cortez, who had recently been promoted to his position through means that no one questioned and no one fully understood, began an investigation that seemed more like a performance than an actual search for truth. The investigation moved quickly, suspiciously quickly, toward a neat and convenient conclusion. Hector had fled the town after embezzling funds from the agricultural cooperative where he worked. It was the perfect explanation, the kind of narrative that allowed everyone to go home satisfied, that provided justification for the corruption, the incompetence, and the deep secrets that the powerful men of San Cristobal guarded like weapons, like treasures, like the keys to their continued dominance. The official story was simple. Hector Mendoza was a thief who had stolen from the community that trusted him. He had run away like a coward, leaving his family behind, leaving his daughter to grow up believing her father was a criminal. It was a clean narrative, one with a beginning and an end, one that required no further investigation, no follow-up questions, no digging into uncomfortable truths. No one questioned the reports that Cortez submitted to his superiors. No one questioned the commissioner who, with remarkable speed and remarkable luck, rose through the political ranks to become the most powerful politician in the state, a man whose influence extended into every corner of government, every business deal, every important decision that affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. No one questioned anything because in San Cristobal, a small town where families had spent generations weaving intricate networks of power and complicity, where everyone knew everyone else's secrets and everyone had agreed to keep quiet in exchange for a piece of the pie, the truth was simply whatever the powerful people decided it would be. Truth was not an objective fact. It was a negotiable commodity, something that could be bent and shaped to fit the needs of those in control. Her mother, Elena Mendoza, was a different kind of woman entirely. She never believed the official story, not for a single moment, not even when the police had closed the case, not even when everyone in town had accepted the narrative and moved on with their lives. Elena possessed a kind of stubborn integrity that refused to accept convenient lies when she knew in her bones that something deeper, something darker, was being hidden. She spent years, literally years, searching for the truth about what had happened to her husband. She spent the family's savings on private detectives who followed leads that went nowhere, on trips to distant towns where people claimed to have seen Hector, on rumors and whispers and half-truths that never added up to anything concrete. Lucia grew up watching her mother's slow transformation, a metamorphosis as painful as watching someone turn to stone. She watched as her mother, once a brilliant woman full of life and energy and optimism, gradually became someone marked by absence and pain, someone whose every waking thought was consumed by the mystery of what had happened to the man she loved. Elena became obsessed, consumed by her search the way fire consumes wood, burning hotter and hotter until it seemed like she might consume herself entirely. But despite everything, despite the years passing without answers, despite the toll it took on her health and her spirit, Elena never gave up. She never accepted defeat. She never surrendered to the comfortable lie. This was the lesson Lucia learned from her mother, a lesson that would define her entire life, that there are truths waiting to be discovered, truths that matter, truths that are worth searching for no matter how long it takes, no matter how much it hurts, no matter what price you have to pay. The truth, Elena had taught her through her actions, if not her words, was always worth pursuing. When Lucia turned 19 years old enough to understand adult secrets and adult pain, her mother sat her down at the kitchen table of their small house and told her what she had finally discovered. The discovery had taken her years to piece together, years of research and interviews and late nights studying documents that shouldn't have been available to her, but somehow were. Hector had not stolen money. That was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect the men who were actually guilty. The agricultural cooperative had been systematically embezzled by its directors, including several prominent local politicians who'd been using the institution as a front, a money laundering operation designed to hide money, obtained through criminal enterprises and to finance their own personal enrichment at the expense of the people the cooperative was supposed to serve. Hector Mendoza, with his inconvenient integrity and his stubborn insistence on doing what was right, had somehow discovered the entire scheme. It wasn't just money that was being stolen. The cooperative was embezzling funds that had been specifically designated for vulnerable farmers, money that had been promised to finance rural infrastructure, resources that had been intended to transform the lives of hundreds of families in the region, to provide them with irrigation systems and equipment and the tools they needed to build better lives. Instead, that money had been stolen by men who wore expensive suits and attended important meetings and were respected in the community. Hector had documented everything with meticulous care, gathering evidence, creating a paper trail, preparing to go to the state authorities with complete documentation of the fraud. He had been preparing to blow the whistle, to expose everything, to make sure that justice was served. But Javier Cortés, who was commissioner and deeply, intimately involved in the fraud, had discovered the plan before Hector could execute it. The consequences were swift and final. Hector never reached the authorities. His body was found weeks later in a ditch outside of town, discarded like trash. The investigation that Cortés subsequently conducted was so incompetent and so corrupt that it actually reached the wrong conclusion entirely. That Hector himself was somehow guilty of crimes, as if the man who had been murdered could somehow be the perpetrator of his own murder. It was a perversion of justice so profound it bordered on absurdity. "I swear to you," Lucia told her mother that night, her hands gripping Elena's cold, trembling hands, her voice shaking with a rage and determination that she had never felt before, "that I will find the truth. I will find it and I will expose it, and I will make sure that every single person responsible for what happened to Father pays for it. All of them, every single one. Her mother looked at her daughter with an expression of infinite sadness, a sadness that came from having suffered for so long, from having hoped for so long, from having been disappointed by the world so many times. "I don't know if that will give you peace, mija," Elena said softly. "I don't know if revenge will make the pain go away or if it will just create new pain. But I know you're the only one who can do this. You're the only one with the strength to do it. You've always been stronger than me. Even when you were just a child, even then you had a strength in you that I never possessed." Lucia left the town the very next day. She left with a fire burning in her chest, a fire that would sustain her for the next 19 years. She traveled to the capital, enrolled in university, studied law with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She specialized in criminal law, focusing particularly on cases involving corruption and white-collar crime. She apprenticed with the most ruthless lawyers in the city, lawyers who had built reputations by destroying the guilty in courtrooms, by exposing lies and holding powerful people accountable. For 19 years, Lucia Mendoza cultivated a reputation that became legendary in legal circles. She became known as a defense attorney who could win cases that every other lawyer in the country considered impossible, cases that seemed hopelessly lost, cases where the defendant appeared to have no hope. She prosecuted politicians who believed themselves untouchable, businessmen who thought their wealth made them immune to consequence, powerful men who had spent their entire lives operating without accountability. She dismantled their defenses, exposed their secrets, and sent them to prison where they belonged. Her name became synonymous with relentless justice. Her rivals feared her. Her clients revered her. Judges treated her with a mixture of respect and fear. But no one in her professional life knew the true reason for her obsession, the flame that burned in her chest even in moments of victory, the oath that had been sworn at the kitchen table of her childhood home. She never spoke of San Cristobal. She never spoke of her father, never shared the personal tragedy that had driven her into the law. She kept her pain locked away, secret, hidden from the world. She guarded her rage as one might guard a precious treasure, feeding it in secret moments, nurturing it, allowing it to grow and transform into something else. Not blind vengeance, but strategic, methodical justice. She discovered through her career that the best weapon against corrupt men was not impulsive revenge, but something far more powerful: strategic patience. The willingness to wait, the ability to see the long game. She learned everything about Javier Cortez. She studied him the way a biologist might study a particularly dangerous organism. She discovered that he was a man of many layers, each one darker than the last, each one revealing new depths of corruption and cruelty. As commissioner, he had orchestrated the disappearances of inconvenient witnesses, people who knew too much, people who could have exposed his crimes. As a politician, he'd facilitated drug trafficking and weapons smuggling through the region, using his official position to protect criminals and ensure that law enforcement looked the other way. As a businessman, though this was done through shell companies and intermediaries, he had accumulated an impossible fortune, wealth that could never have been earned through his official government salary, wealth that came from blood money and stolen resources. Lucia compiled documents, recordings, testimonies from victims and witnesses. She did this work carefully, methodically, never rushing, never leaving loose threads that could be traced back to her. She created a mosaic of truth, a picture that only she could see at first, a puzzle that only she understood completely. Each year, the picture became clearer, more detailed, more damning. She extended the same careful attention to the other men who had been involved in the original crime, the other cogs in the machine of corruption that had destroyed her father and nearly destroyed her mother. There was Ruben Sandoval, the exalcade who had authorized the theft of public funds and who had used those stolen resources to enrich his own family beyond measure. There was Carlos Fuentes, the businessman who had created shell companies specifically designed to launder the stolen money, who had hidden criminal assets through fraudulent investment schemes that had defrauded legitimate investors. There was Maria Isabel Quintero, an attorney who had drafted fraudulent documents and provided legal cover for the guilty, who had helped construct the legal framework that protected the criminals. There was Armando Delgado, a judge who had buried inconvenient files and ensured that any investigation that might have exposed the truth never reached trial. And there was Roberto Mendez, a banker who had moved millions of pesos through accounts that should have raised red flags years ago, accounts that were clearly tied to criminal activity. All of them were interconnected, linked together in a network of corruption that spread like rotten roots through the entire power structure of the state. They protected each other, covered for each other, helped each other escape justice. Together they had created a system of corruption so comprehensive, so deeply embedded in the institutions of power, that it seemed almost impossible that one person could ever bring it down. But now, as the plane descended toward her home state, and Lucia saw the familiar landscape of her childhood approaching below her, everything changed in an instant. None of the careful plans she had been making, none of the strategic thinking that had driven her for nearly 2 decades mattered anymore. Her mother was in a coma, unconscious, fighting for her life in a hospital bed. She didn't know if she would have the opportunity to speak with her mother again before she woke up, if she woke up at all. The possibility that Elena might die before Lucia had a chance to tell her that she had done it, that she had found the truth, that justice would be served. This possibility hit her like a physical blow. Suddenly, the revenge didn't seem important. The careful case she had been building over nearly 2 decades seemed to fade into insignificance. All she wanted, with a primal intensity that surprised her, was to see her mother open her eyes. All she wanted was to know that Elena would live. The San Cristobal Hospital was an old, dilapidated building that looked as though it hadn't been significantly updated since the 1970s. It sat on the outskirts of town, removed from the main thoroughfare, a gray concrete structure with small windows and a sense of decay that seemed to permeate every brick. Lucia ran down the corridors with her suitcase still in her hands, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She ignored the curious stares of the nurses, the looks that passed between staff members as they recognized her. Small towns never forget. People always remember the faces of those who have left, the ones who have escaped to bigger cities and supposedly better lives. She was the daughter of Hector Mendoza, the man who supposedly had betrayed the entire community, the man who had stolen from the cooperative and then fled like a coward. Or so the official narrative claimed. Lucia could feel the weight of history on her shoulders, the weight of the lies that had been told and retold and accepted as truth for so long. She knew that her return would provoke speculation and whispers, that stories would be woven and spread through the town squares and the shops, that people would construct narratives around her unexpected homecoming. Elena lay in the hospital bed like a puppet with the strings cut, a figure that was technically alive but lacking any of the vitality that made life worth living. She was impossibly pale, almost translucent, as though the blood had been drained from her body. Her gray hair was scattered haphazardly across the white pillow like spilled thread. Tubes ran into her arms at multiple points, feeding her, medicating her, sustaining her body mechanically. A large breathing machine stood beside the bed, its rhythmic whooshing sound filling the small room. It was assisting each of Elena's breaths, each rise and fall of her chest, now controlled by machinery rather than by her own will. The machine made her look like a marionette being operated by an invisible puppeteer. Her chest rising and falling mechanically, like a bellows, like something mechanical rather than organic. Lucia approached slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something fragile, something that might break if she made any sudden movements. She knew that any jarring motion, any disruption, any abrupt change in the carefully controlled environment of this hospital room might damage something in her mother's delicate condition, might sever the thin thread that was keeping her tethered to life. "Mom," she whispered, reaching out and taking her mother's hand. It was cold, so very cold, and Lucia felt a chill run through her own body at the sensation. "It's me. I came back. Wake up, please. Wake up. I need you to wake up. I need to tell you something important." But Elena didn't move. Her eyes remained closed, their lids sealed shut. Her chest continued its mechanical rise and fall, the machine continuing its relentless work. There was no response, no recognition, no sign that her mother could hear her or even knew she was there. A doctor appeared, an older man, with gray in his beard and exhaustion in his eyes, and explained the situation in clinical, detached language. Elena had suffered a massive cerebrovascular accident, a stroke of extraordinary severity. The next few days would be critical. There was no guarantee that she would survive, and if she did survive, there was no way to predict what kind of recovery she might make. She should prepare herself for any outcome. The word coma sounded in Lucia's ears like a death sentence, like a verdict, like the end of hope. But then the doctor added something else, something that caught Lucia's attention. It was very fortunate that Elena had been found so quickly, he said. The stroke had occurred on a remote road outside of town, a road that wasn't heavily traveled. If Elena had lain there for much longer before receiving medical attention, if the ambulance hadn't arrived when it did, she almost certainly would have died. It was a remarkable coincidence, the doctor said, that an ambulance had happened to be in that area at that exact moment. Almost miraculous, he said, using a word that would later take on darker, more sinister meanings for Lucia. Lucia spent the first night in the chair beside her mother's bed. She remained awake, holding Elena's cold hand, speaking to her mother about her life in the capital, about the cases she had won, about the law firm she had built, about the life she had constructed far from San Cristobal. She spoke as if her mother could hear her, because in her heart she believed that she could. The human voice carries something, she thought. Even in unconsciousness, the familiar voice of a loved one might provide some kind of anchor, some kind of connection to the waking world. She told Elena about clients she had saved from wrongful imprisonment, about politicians she had seen convicted and sent to prison, about the satisfaction of seeing justice prevail in courts where she had fought relentlessly for the truth. She told her about friends she had made in the capital, about places she had visited, about movies she had seen and books she had read. She spoke about everything, filling the room with words, as if by doing so she could prevent the silence from consuming her mother, as if the sound of her voice could serve as a lifeline, pulling Elena back from the darkness. At dawn, when exhaustion finally overcame her despite her determination to stay awake, Lucia fell asleep with her head resting on the mattress beside her mother's bed. Her hand remained intertwined with Elena's, the two of them connected even in sleep. A kind nurse covered her with a blanket, and for a few hours Lucia experienced a peace that she hadn't felt in almost 2 decades. But even in sleep, her mind remained active, processing information, connecting dots, reconstructing scenarios in the shadows of her dreams. When she woke at noon on the second day, disoriented and stiff from sleeping in an awkward position, she was not alone. Javier, Cortez, stood in the doorway of the hospital room as if he owned it, as if he had every right to be there, as if his presence was perfectly natural and expected. He was older than Lucia remembered him being, though she had only seen him once or twice in the years since she had left San Cristobal. She had tracked his rise through the political ranks, through news articles and public records, but seeing him in person, seeing the physical reality of him, was different. He was still an imposing figure, still radiating an air of power and control, though the years had left their marks on him. His hair, once black and shiny with pomade, was now silver gray, combed back with military precision. He wore a suit that must have cost more than many people earned in a month, expensive fabric tailored perfectly to his frame. His cufflinks were gold, gleaming in the fluorescent light of the hospital room. Around his wrist was a watch that probably cost more than a car. On his fingers were 5 rings, each one set with a precious stone that caught the light and sparkled. He was the physical embodiment of a man who had benefited enormously from corruption, a man who had climbed over the bodies of others to reach the position he now occupied, a man who had never paid any price for his crimes because he was too powerful, too connected, too thoroughly embedded in the systems of power. He carried with him the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume, something imported and exclusive, a smell so strong it seemed almost suffocating in the confined space of the hospital room. It was the smell of a man who wanted to make sure everyone knew he had money, who wanted his wealth to announce itself, who wanted people to understand his power the moment he entered a room. "Lucia Mendoza," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, his smile calculated to appear friendly while conveying absolutely no warmth. His smile was the smile of a predator, Lucia thought. Well, well, what a surprise. I haven't seen you since you were a child, just a little girl in school uniforms. What have you been doing all these years? I imagine you've been far from here, building a life somewhere else, far away from your humble origins. Lucia sat up slowly in her chair, her mind suddenly sharp, all traces of sleep vanishing instantly. She evaluated the situation with the precise, analytical mind of a chess player assessing a complex board. Cortez wasn't being overtly threatening. That was what made it so much more dangerous. He was being cordial, being charming, being the kind of powerful man who didn't need to raise his voice or make threats because his power was so obvious, so absolute, that it didn't need to be announced. She understood how his mind worked. He was assessing her, trying to determine the level of threat she posed, trying to figure out whether she knew something. He wanted to probe her mentally, to test her, to see if she would break under the subtle pressure of his presence. "Governor Cortez," Lucia responded, her voice shifting into the tone she used in courtrooms, the voice of a professional lawyer, cold, controlled, impenetrable. It was the voice that had terrified guilty men, that had made them second-guess their decisions, that had sometimes caused them to make mistakes that led to their own conviction. "I've heard a great deal about you. It seems your career has progressed very well since I left San Cristobal." "Very well indeed," he said, a note of barely concealed pride in his voice. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down without asking permission, crossing his legs in a gesture that was meant to convey absolute confidence. "I have served the state for many years now. I have brought progress, development, security. I have transformed this region. Your mother should be proud to live in a state that has flourished under my leadership. Of course, it's unfortunate that she had this accident." The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Cortez had emphasized it, had drawn it out, had loaded it with meaning. Lucia noticed how he had pronounced the word accident, how he had elongated the first vowel as if putting the word in audible quotation marks. Was it a warning? Or was she reading too much into the subtext? No. Lucia had trained herself over nearly 2 decades to read the smallest signs, to interpret the subtle communications that occurred beneath the surface of words. She was not paranoid. She was observant, and she had learned that men like Cortez, men who had accumulated power through crime and corruption, always left clues. They couldn't help themselves. It was like a predator that couldn't resist leaving its claw marks on its prey. A killer who couldn't help but return to the scene of the crime. "What exactly happened?" Lucia asked, her eyes never leaving his face, her body language conveying a perfect absence of fear. It was important that he see she wasn't afraid, that she wasn't easily intimidated by his presence or his power. "I would like to understand the circumstances of my mother's accident. The doctors have been somewhat vague in their explanations." It was on that road outside town, Cortez said, gesturing casually as though discussing something of no particular importance. You know the road, I mean, the one that goes toward the valley, that winds through the rural areas. Your mother was driving her car. Apparently the brakes failed. It was a mechanical failure, you see. She lost control, the car went off the road, hit some trees with quite a bit of force. It happened very fast, according to the witnesses who happened to be passing by. She was very fortunate. Fortunate, Lucia repeated. Yes, fortunate, he continued, because an ambulance was nearby, one of our new emergency ambulances that I've been implementing throughout the region as part of my modernization efforts. They arrived within minutes, administered. Emergency care, got her to the hospital. It was really quite remarkable when you think about it. The coordination, the timing, the luck of it all. Almost miraculous, one might say. If she had been lying on that road for much longer, she certainly would have died. His eyes were telling a different story than his words. Lucia had learned to read eyes, to see the truth that lurked beneath the surface of carefully constructed words. His eyes said he knew exactly what had happened. His eyes said he had ordered it to happen. His eyes said he was enjoying the performance, enjoying standing in this hospital room beside the bed of the woman he had tried to kill, telling her daughter that her mother had simply been the victim of bad luck and a mechanical failure. It was a game of power, subtly orchestrated, carefully choreographed. Cortez was demonstrating his dominance. He was showing Lucia that he knew who she was, that he knew why she had returned home, that he was aware of whatever investigation her mother might have been conducting, and he was warning her in the most subtle way possible that he could reach her, that he could hurt the people she loved, that he had the power to make accidents happen whenever it suited his purposes. How convenient, Lucia said, allowing a slight smile to cross her face, a smile that reflected the same coldness as his. That an ambulance happened to be passing at that exact moment, on a road that's barely used, a road that most people avoid. It almost seems like someone had prior knowledge that something would happen, almost like someone arranged for medical personnel to be in that area at that specific time. Life is full of coincidences, Cortez replied with a shrug, affecting an air of indifference that was clearly feigned. Things happen that we don't expect. Fortunately, in this case, the coincidence worked in your mother's favor. Of course, I'm very glad you've come back. Your mother needs her family around her at a time like this. Family is important. Family bonds are sacred. He paused, and Lucia could see him choosing his next words with careful precision. And also, he added, his tone shifting slightly, a note of threat entering his voice where there had been none before. It would be good for you to remember where your roots are. San Cristobal is your home. It's where you come from. Some places don't let their children run away forever without consequences. The world has a way of balancing itself out, of restoring equilibrium, of making sure that debts are paid. Lucia didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, holding his gaze, allowing him to see that she was not intimidated, that she was not backing down, that she understood exactly what he was communicating without words. It was a moment of pure tension, two predators assessing each other, both of them understanding completely what was being communicated in the silence between them. Both of them aware of the stakes, both of them knowing that this was not a casual encounter between old acquaintances, but rather a confrontation between two opposing forces. Cortez stood up slowly, with the deliberate movements of someone who owned the space he occupied. He walked toward the door, then turned back at the threshold. He raised his hand in a gesture of farewell that was ambiguous. It could have been a friendly wave, or it could have been something else entirely, something more threatening, something laden with meaning. After he left, Lucia sat in the chair beside her mother's bed for more than 3 hours. She didn't move. She barely breathed. Her mind worked at superhuman speed, connecting dots, seeing patterns, constructing a complete picture of what must have happened. The accident was not accidental. That much was immediately clear. A competent detective, a person trained in investigation, would have recognized within minutes that something about the official story didn't add up. Cortez wouldn't come to the hospital to visit his would-be victim unless he had a specific reason. Her mother had been searching for the truth for 19 years, and suddenly, at the precise moment when she might be close to finding something significant, she suffers a mysterious accident on a remote road, an accident that happens to be witnessed by people who report it quickly, an accident that happens to occur near an ambulance. Coincidence? No. Lucia didn't believe in coincidences, not in her life, not when the pattern was this obvious. Cortez had calculated that an ambulance would be nearby. He had probably given specific orders to the hospital to increase ambulance patrols on that particular road on that particular day. It was exactly the kind of detail that a man with sufficient power and control could arrange. Cortez wanted Elena to survive, wanted her to know that he had the power to kill her if he chose to, but that he was choosing not to, at least not yet. It was a demonstration of power, a message, a warning. Something her mother had discovered had frightened Cortez enough to act, and that meant one thing with absolute certainty. The truth was closer than ever. So close, Lucia could almost smell it. Lucia moved with purpose over the next 24 hours. She went to the police station, a small building that hadn't changed much since she had last seen it as a child. The new commissioner, a young man named Sergio Morales, seemed honest, or at least young enough not to be completely corrupted by the system. Lucia asked to see the accident reports related to her mother's incident. She was polite, respectful, kind. She was the concerned daughter of a victim, not the ruthless criminal defense attorney with a 19-year-old vendetta. The reports she eventually obtained were revealing precisely because of what they were missing. There were no detailed photographs of the damaged vehicle, no thorough documentation of the scene. There were no written testimonies from the witnesses who had reported the accident, only a simple list of names with no contact information. There were no documents from the mechanics who supposedly had inspected the vehicle and determined the cause of the accident. There were no hospital records from the ambulance service that had responded to the call. It was as if someone had deliberately cleaned up the scene, had sanitized the official record, had removed all the details that might have revealed something suspicious. The car was destroyed, the commissioner told her when she asked about the vehicle. For spare parts, it's the standard procedure. After serious accidents, the vehicles are towed to the city lot and dismantled for salvageable parts. It was a lie. Lucia knew it was a lie. That was not standard procedure at all. It was what Cortez had ordered to be done, to destroy the evidence of his attempted murder. The car had almost certainly been sabotaged by someone, a mechanic, someone with technical knowledge, someone who understood how to manipulate automotive systems. The brakes had probably been cut or manipulated in such a way that they would fail at a specific moment, at a specific location, at a speed that would cause maximum damage. That night, Lucia drove to her childhood home. The key was still where her mother had always kept it, beneath a pot of geraniums in the backyard, exactly where she had remembered it being all these years. The house felt like a tomb, a place frozen in time. Nothing had changed since her last visit 19 years ago. The furniture sat in the same arrangement, the same photographs hung on the walls. But Lucia noticed that her mother had added many more photographs in recent years. Photos of Hector when he was young, at his wedding to Elena in a small village church, in his white officer's uniform. Photos of Hector holding baby Lucia, his face radiant with pride. Photos of the family together on vacation, before everything had fallen apart. It was as if Elena had been engaged in an act of preservation, trying to keep Hector's memory alive, making him present in the house through images to compensate for his physical absence. She had created a kind of shrine, a sanctuary of memory in the house that had once been a home. Lucia went upstairs to her mother's bedroom. The desk was covered with papers and files and handwritten notes. Elena's handwriting was clear and precise, made even more legible by the fact that she had written so obsessively, so repeatedly over the years. There were calendars with dates marked in red, names underlined multiple times, lines and arrows drawn between documents, connecting them, showing relationships and sequences of events. Elena had been as careful and as methodical as a detective, as precise as a scientist. For 19 years, her mother had been doing exactly what Lucia was doing in her legal career, collecting evidence, connecting dots, building a case that would be undeniable. In the closet, Lucia found a red folder hidden beneath a loose board, concealed among old clothes. She had to pull back layers of forgotten garments, things her mother hadn't worn in years, things that smelled of time and dust. Inside the folder were documents, hundreds of documents, financial records that Elena must have obtained through means she didn't fully understand. Bank statements scanned and copied, emails printed out on paper, photographs of official documents, ledgers and transaction records. Her mother had somehow obtained copies of financial transactions showing payments from the agricultural cooperative directly to accounts belonging to Javier Cortez. The amounts were substantial, millions of pesos, stolen money, moved through the system, laundered and hidden. Elena had documented everyone involved in the fraud, with lines showing who was connected to whom, who had authorized what, who had benefited from the theft. And most importantly, she had documented witnesses, names of people who had knowledge of the crime, addresses, phone numbers, notes about conversations Elena had apparently had with them. But there was more. Beneath everything else, Lucia found a letter. It was unsealed, addressed to her in her mother's handwriting. The paper was cream-colored, the ink blue. Elena's handwriting was still clear, still firm, despite the years of obsessive writing that had left her hands cramped and painful. My beloved daughter, if you are reading this, it is because I have finally found the definitive proof, the missing piece of the puzzle that I have been searching for all these years. I have located a man who was present the night your father disappeared. His name is Roberto Sanchez, and he worked as a security guard for the agricultural cooperative. He has been living in the city all this time, afraid, hiding, moving from place to place to ensure he doesn't leave a pattern that could be traced. He has been living half a life, never settling anywhere permanently, never allowing himself to have real friends or genuine relationships. He has been existing like a ghost, a man haunted by what he witnessed. But recently he suffered a heart attack. When he believed he was dying, when he thought he was facing the end of his life, he decided that he could not carry this terrible secret to his grave. He decided that he needed to confess what he knows, that the burden of silence had become too heavy to bear any longer. What I am about to tell you is worse than we ever imagined, Lucia. Much worse. Javier Cortez did not simply order your father's death. He did it himself, with his own hands. Your father was beaten, Lucia. He was tortured. He was murdered in the cooperative's warehouse because he dared to threaten to expose them all, because he dared to stand up against men with power, because he chose to do what was right even when it was dangerous. According to Roberto, who heard everything from the adjacent room, Cortez beat your father for hours. He interrogated him, asking him who else knew about the fraud, where he had hidden the evidence, who he had told. It was brutally personal. Roberto said that Cortez seemed to enjoy it, that there was something in his voice that suggested he was taking pleasure in the violence, in the control, in the power he had over your father's life. Lucia, I have spent 19 years searching for this truth. 19 years. I have sacrificed my life, my happiness, the years that I should have spent watching you grow up without this burden weighing on both of us. I have sacrificed my sanity more times than I can count. I have been on the brink of complete collapse, ready to give up, ready to surrender to despair and depression. But I could not live in a world where your father's murderer walked free, where he thrived, where he gained more power, where he was venerated as a hero by people who didn't know what he had done. I could not. It would have meant that all the suffering, all the pain, your father's disappearance, my years of searching, it all would have been meaningless. It all would have been in vain. But now I am tired. My daughter. I can feel it in my bones. I am aging. My strength is abandoning me. My hands tremble when I write these words. My memory is not what it used to be. The fire that has sustained me for so long is beginning to dim. I have done what I could. I have put all the pieces of the puzzle in their proper places. I have left the breadcrumbs for someone intelligent to follow, for someone with the strength to finish what I have started. What happens from this moment forward depends entirely on you. You are stronger than I am. You have the resources, the intelligence, the emotional coldness that I never possessed. You have the law as your weapon, not just the abstract truth. You can finish what I began. You can bring justice in a way that I never could. But I must ask you to promise me one thing, my daughter. When you have won, when you have seen justice served, when Cortez is imprisoned where he should have been 19 years ago, you must allow yourself to live. Do not let revenge consume your life the way it has consumed mine. I have allowed the search for justice to devour my best years, to poison my happiness, to transform me into someone I don't recognize. Revenge is a poison, Lucia. It poisons the poisoner, yes, but it also kills the one who drinks it. I have seen what it has done to me. I have watched my own life become smaller and smaller until it contained nothing but the search for the truth. I do not want that for you. Promise me that when this is over, you will find a way to live again. Promise me that you will not make my mistakes. I love you more than life itself. Your mother, Elena Lucia, read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking, her eyes blurring with tears that ran hot and bitter down her cheeks. The words blurred and reformed, blurred again, but when she finally looked up from the last line, when she finally put the letter down on the bed beside her, her eyes were pure steel. All the emotion, all the pain had crystallized into something harder and more durable. Determination, resolve, the kind of cold clarity that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done. Roberto Sanchez was easy to find. Her mother had documented everything with meticulous care. She had addresses, phone numbers, notes about his employment history. Lucia hired a private investigator, a man who had worked with her on previous cases and who understood the importance of discretion and precision. Within a week, the investigator had located Roberto in a city 200 kilometers from San Cristobal. He lived in a 4th-floor apartment in a gray, anonymous building that looked like dozens of other buildings in the city. He worked as a janitor in a mid-rise office building, a job that kept him invisible, that allowed him to move through the world without attracting attention. It was the kind of life someone lives when they are hiding in plain sight, when they have chosen obscurity and anonymity as their shield against the world. When Lucia entered his life, she did so carefully, presenting herself as a legal investigator. But Roberto knew immediately who she was. It was in his reaction, the way his face went pale, the way his hands began to shake, the way his eyes suddenly filled with tears. It was practically a confession, that reaction. And it was also something else. It was relief. After 19 years of carrying this secret alone, after 19 years of fear and silence and isolation, he finally had someone to tell. The weight he had been carrying alone for so long was finally going to be shared. "I didn't want to do it," he said immediately, the words tumbling out of him as if they had been trapped behind a dam that was now broken. "Cortez forced me. He told me that if I didn't cooperate, if I didn't help him with what he was about to do, I would be killed too. He was very clear about it. He said there was a very high price for disloyalty, a price paid in blood. You were a child, I remember. You were in school when everything happened. Probably in class, learning to multiply or learning to spell words, completely unaware that your father was being murdered just a few kilometers away. Lucia registered herself at a nearby hotel under a false name. She spent 5 days with Roberto, sitting in his small apartment listening to his story, recording his confession on a small digital recorder that she kept hidden in her purse. He documented every detail of what he had witnessed that night 19 years ago. His words were like pieces of a bomb, words that would shatter Javier Cortez's empire, words that would bring down everything the man had built on lies and corruption. The account was brutal in its specificity. Hector had gone to meet with Cortez in the cooperative's warehouse late at night. He had gone there to tell Cortez that he was going to the state police with complete evidence of the fraud. He had gone there thinking he was going to have a conversation, to try to convince Cortez to confess, to try to resolve the matter through dialogue. But Cortez was not a man who engaged in dialogue. Cortez was a man who solved problems through violence. When Hector told him what he planned to do, Cortez had become enraged. His fury was immediate and absolute. He had drawn a gun, a pistol that he kept in a drawer in his office. Hector had tried to run, had tried to escape, had tried to reach the door. But the warehouse was large, and Cortez was faster. There had been a struggle, physical and desperate, the two men grappling for control of the weapon. Then Cortez had fired. A single shot, the sound of a bullet leaving the barrel, the sound of a body falling, the finality of death. Roberto had been in an adjacent room taking inventory of supplies. He had heard everything through the thin walls. He had heard the argument escalating. He had heard the struggle. He had heard the gunshot. And then, worst of all, he had heard the silence that followed. When Cortez emerged from the room where Hector lay dead, he was holding the pistol. His face was calm. His breathing was controlled. He found Roberto standing in the hallway, frozen in terror. Cortez showed him the gun. He didn't need to say much. He simply told him one thing, in a voice that Roberto described as completely emotionless, as though he were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "If you talk," Cortez said, his voice flat and cold, "I'll kill you. I'll kill your family. I'll disappear your mother. I'll hunt down your sisters. I'll spend the rest of my life hunting you if I have to. Do you understand me?" For 19 years, Roberto Sanchez lived with that threat hanging over his head like a sword. He never married. He never had children. He never built a real life, never allowed himself to settle anywhere, never permitted anyone to get close to him. He simply existed, moving from city to city, taking whatever work he could find, living paycheck to paycheck, existing like a phantom, like a ghost haunting the spaces between the living. Every knock on his door made his heart race. Every unexpected phone call filled him with dread. He spent 19 years waiting for the day when Cortez would decide that he was a loose end that needed to be tied up. "Will I be safe now?" he asked Lucia with a fragile hope that nearly broke her heart when she told him that it was time to present his testimony, that it was time for his name to appear in legal documents, that it was time to stop hiding, that it was time to step into the light. "Yes," Lucia assured him, taking his hands in hers. "Cortez is going to be very busy with other matters. Very, very busy. When I'm finished with him, he won't have the power to hurt anyone ever again. You have my word." Lucia returned to San Cristobal with Roberto Sanchez's recorded confession, with her mother's red folder full of documents, and with a plan that had been ripening in her mind for nearly 2 decades. It was a perfect plan because it did not depend on a single tactic or a single piece of evidence. It was not vulnerable to being undermined by one well-placed lie or one clever legal maneuver. Instead, it was constructed like a fortress, like a building made of stone and steel, with multiple reinforcing walls, with redundancy built in at every level. It was a mosaic of truth, each piece supporting the others, each revelation building on the last. It was a structure that could not collapse without dismantling the entire system of corrupt power that Javier Cortez had built. and Lucia had learned during her career in law that the best, most effective way to overthrow a corrupt empire was not to attack it head-on, but to make the pillars collapse from within, to turn the collaborators against each other, to exploit the fractures that always existed in these networks of corruption. But first, Lucia needed her mother to wake up. Everything depended on that. She couldn't move forward, couldn't execute her plan, couldn't do any of what needed to be done until she knew that Elena would live, that she would have the chance to look her mother in the eyes and tell her that the work was done, that justice was coming. On the fourth day after Lucia's return to San Cristobal, when the doctors had begun to speak in hushed tones about the declining probability of Elena's recovery, when the conversations in town had shifted from hopeful speculation to mournful acceptance, when people had begun mentally preparing themselves for a funeral rather than a reunion, something happened that the medical staff would later describe, with genuine bewilderment, as a miracle. Lucia was sitting in her usual chair beside her mother's bed, holding Elena's cold hand, reading through a case, file that she had brought with her from the capital. It was a real estate fraud case, nothing particularly important, certainly nothing compared to what was happening in this small hospital room. She was reading the details to her mother, speaking about how the defendants had believed themselves too clever to be caught, too sophisticated to make mistakes. She was doing what she had done every day, filling the silence with words, maintaining the connection. She was in the middle of describing a particularly egregious deception when she noticed a change. It was subtle, barely perceptible. The rhythm of her mother's breathing shifted slightly, and then, in the next moment, Elena's eyes moved beneath her closed eyelids, not a random movement, a deliberate movement, a conscious movement, as if her mother's mind was awakening from the depths of sleep, as if she was swimming up from darkness toward light. Gradually, slowly, as if she were struggling against an immense weight, as if she were fighting her way up through the deepest waters of a black ocean, Elena's eyes opened. At first, there was nothing in them, no focus, no awareness, just a blank stare that seemed to look through Lucia rather than at her. But then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, focus began to return. Elena's eyes adjusted, her pupils contracted, and then, with absolute certainty, she looked directly at her daughter. CIA, she whispered, her voice destroyed by the tubes that had been in her throat for days, her voice rough as sandpaper, barely a breath, but it was the most beautiful sound Lucia had ever heard. "It's me, Mom. I'm here. Everything's okay. You're safe," Lucia said, her own voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. She kissed her mother's forehead, cradled her mother's face in her hands, unable to believe that Elena's eyes were open, that she was looking back at her, that she had returned from the darkness. Elena tried to speak, but the breathing tube prevented her. She made sounds, formed words with her lips that no sound could carry. Lucia called for the nurses immediately, and in the hours that followed, they carefully removed the tubes, administered medications, conducted neurological evaluations. They asked Elena to move her toes, to follow lights with her eyes, to squeeze her hands. The doctor eventually determined, with genuine surprise in his voice, that Elena had been extraordinarily fortunate. The stroke had not damaged the critical areas of her brain responsible for speech or cognition. With intensive therapy and rehabilitation, she would probably recover most of her functions. She might even walk again, though she would probably require a cane or some form of physical support. "It was a miracle she survived," said the doctor, with genuine perplexity on his face. "Given the severity of the stroke, the amount of time that passed before she received treatment, she should have died. I cannot explain it medically. She should not be alive. But she is." Lucia didn't believe in miracles. She believed in causality, in cause and effect, in the concrete forces of the universe. But she also understood that her mother was an extraordinarily strong woman, and that the strength of Elena's determination to live, her need to see justice done, her purpose unfinished, these things might have been enough to pull her back from the edge of death. Her mother had unfinished business. There was a truth that needed to be told, a justice that needed to be served. Elena's body had refused to surrender because her spirit knew her work was not complete. That night, when the hospital had grown quiet, when the nurses had retired to their stations, Lucia approached her mother's bed. Elena was awake but exhausted, her eyes struggling to stay open despite her obvious determination to remain conscious. "I've found the truth, Mom," Lucia whispered, leaning close so her mother could hear her clearly. "I've found Roberto Sanchez. He saw everything. He was there. He knows exactly what Cortez did. And now," she added, her voice taking on a quality of iron determination, "Cortez is going to pay. They all will. Every single one of them. Every accomplice, every person who participated, every person who stayed silent when they could have spoken." Elena took her daughter's hand with surprising strength, a strength that seemed to come from deep places within her being, a strength that defied her weakened body. She squeezed Lucia's hand with every ounce of power she could muster. She didn't need to speak. Her daughter understood her perfectly. After 19 years of searching, the long journey was finally coming to an end. Lucia got to work immediately, but she did not make the mistake of presenting her case to the state attorney general's office all at once, in a single neat package with a bow. That would have been clumsy, would have raised red flags, would have given Cortez's allies time to mobilize their defenses and prepare their counterattacks. Javier Cortez had friends in high places, people who owed him favors, people whose careers or fortunes depended on his continued power and protection. If Lucia moved too obviously, too directly, those people would undermine her efforts, would find ways to suppress evidence, would manufacture reasonable doubt. Lucia was far smarter than that. She had learned from her years as a defense attorney that the most effective way to bring down a corrupt system was not through direct confrontation, but through patient, methodical strategy. She played the long game. First, she presented the financial evidence to an investigative reporter at an important regional publication, a newspaper with credibility and reach. She did it carefully, anonymously, through intermediaries. She made the reporter believe that it was his own idea to investigate the fraudulent transactions of the agricultural cooperative from 19 years ago. She provided hints, suggestions, pieces of information that led him down a path that she had carefully constructed. The reporter, a man with good instincts and good training, took the bait. He spent 3 weeks conducting thorough research, interviewing sources, verifying facts. He published a carefully researched series of articles about the systemic fraud that had been occurring in San Cristobal for years. The articles didn't mention Javier Cortez by name, but anyone with the ability to read between the lines could make the connections. The missing money, the powerful men who had benefited, the names that appeared again and again in the narrative. The local scandal began to attract attention from larger media outlets. National reporters picked up the story. Suddenly, what had been a small-town story became part of a larger national narrative about political corruption, about the abuse of power, about the way powerful people in Mexico used their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of the poor and vulnerable. The pressure built. Day after day, the story appeared in more newspapers. Television news programs began covering it. People who had been silent for years began to talk. Old information resurfaced. People started asking questions, demanding answers, calling for investigations. Then, when the pressure was at its absolute peak, when Cortez was under intense public scrutiny, when the state governor was being pressured to respond to the scandal, Lucia presented Roberto Sanchez's testimony to the federal attorney general. She presented the recordings, the transcripts, all the circumstantial and direct evidence that Javier Cortez, now the state governor, had committed first-degree murder 19 years ago. She presented her mother's documents, the financial records showing the corruption. She presented a case that was impossible to deny, impossible to refute, a case that built layer upon layer of evidence until the weight of it became undeniable. The Federal Attorney General's office, which operated outside the state power structure and therefore wasn't beholden to Cortez's influence, took the evidence seriously. They launched an investigation. They began interviewing witnesses. They began assembling their own case. Javier Cortez's reaction was immediate and fierce. First, he tried intimidation. He sent an intermediary, a large man with scars on his face, someone Lucia recognized as having worked as an enforcer for Cortez's network years ago. This man appeared at Lucia's law office without announcement, closed the door, and delivered a message in a tone that was quiet but absolutely threatening. "The governor has heard about your activities," the man said carefully. "He wants you to understand that some things are better left in the past, that some lies are more useful than some truths, and that accidents," he emphasized the word deliberately, "seem to happen to people who ask too many questions." Lucia smiled, but there was no fear in her smile. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," the man said. "Well," Lucia responded, her voice ice cold, "here's my advice for the governor. Tell him I have recordings of this conversation. Tell him I have documentation of every threat, every intimidation, every attempt to obstruct justice that he will have made. And tell him that if anything happens to me, to my mother, to anyone I know, that documentation goes directly to the federal police, the media, and the international court if necessary. Tell him he's no longer the man with the power. Now the power is on my side." The man left. But Lucia knew this wasn't the end. Cortez was a cornered animal, and cornered animals become more dangerous, more desperate, more willing to take risks. So she documented everything. She recorded the visit of the intermediary. She recorded the threat. She preserved everything, turning each of Cortez's moves into additional evidence against him. When Cortez tried to bribe witnesses, offering Roberto Sanchez money to retract his testimony, Lucia was there to record it. When he tried to make Sanchez disappear, attempting to have him kidnapped, Lucia had arranged police protection and documented the kidnapping attempt. Every move he made, she was there, waiting, recording, documenting, turning each desperate action into another piece of evidence. When he tried to destroy records, sending people to the hospital to steal Elena's medical files, Lucia had already made multiple copies and given them to the federal police. The attempted theft was captured on security cameras. Each time Cortez made a move, each time he tried to cover his tracks or silence his witnesses, he only succeeded in digging himself deeper into a hole, in creating more evidence of his guilt, in demonstrating his consciousness of guilt, in proving to any jury that he was desperately trying to hide something. Finally, after weeks of investigation, the federal attorney general's office issued an arrest warrant. Javier Cortez was detained at the airport as he attempted to flee the country. He was caught at the departure terminal, his suitcases packed with cash, fake documents that would have allowed him to start a new life in some country where extradition treaties with Mexico did not apply. He was handcuffed in front of other passengers waiting for their flights, in front of reporters who had been tipped off that something significant was about to happen. The moment of his arrest was captured on cameras and broadcast on the evening news. The powerful governor, who had seemed untouchable, was led away in handcuffs like a common criminal. The fall came rapidly after his arrest, so rapidly that it was almost viscerally satisfying for Lucia to witness. The other people involved in the original conspiracy, seeing that Cortez was being prosecuted, that the legal machinery of the state had been set in motion against him, began turning on each other like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Carlos Fuentes, the businessman, was the first to seek a plea deal. He offered to testify against everyone else in exchange for a reduced sentence. Maria Isabel Quintero, the attorney, was arrested when federal agents found her in her office, attempting to destroy documents. Ruben Sandoval, the former mayor, was found hiding in a neighboring state and was extradited back. Armando Delgado, the corrupt judge, was arrested at his home in the early morning hours. Roberto Mendez, the banker, was found attempting to cross the border into the United States and was apprehended by Border Patrol agents. One by one, they were arrested. One by one, they began cooperating with authorities, hoping to reduce their own sentences, hoping to save themselves by throwing the others under the bus. The network of corruption that had seemed so solid, so firmly entrenched, so impossible to challenge, began to unravel, each person trying to save themselves, each person willing to testify against the others, each person contributing another piece to the puzzle of evidence. The trial that followed was the largest that the state had seen in decades. It lasted 4 months, with dozens of witnesses, hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, thousands of pages of financial documents and email correspondence and recorded conversations. The entire sordid, complex narrative of corruption was unpacked in the courtroom, displayed for public view, analyzed and dissected by prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges. The media covered it obsessively, as if they had been given access to the greatest crime story of the year. Lucia was not the prosecutor. She requested a conflict of interest, acknowledging that her personal connection to the victim, that her father had been murdered, that her mother had been attacked, could cloud her judgment and compromise the integrity of the prosecution. But she was in the courtroom every single day, sitting in the back row, watching as the truth that her mother had spent 19 years searching for finally came into the light of public knowledge, watching as liars were confronted with their lies, as contradictions were exposed, as the carefully constructed narratives began to collapse under the weight of evidence, and watching as the man who had murdered her father, who had covered up his crime with layers of power and corruption, finally faced justice. Javier Cortez's demeanor during the trial was revealing. He was arrogant. He was defiant. He never showed a moment of genuine remorse. He testified that he had done what he needed to do to protect the interests of the state. He testified that Hector Mendoza had been a dangerous idealist who would have destroyed the region with his insistence on transparency and honesty. He testified that his only regret was not being more careful in covering up what he had done. The jury looked at him with absolute contempt. The verdict, when it finally came, was never in doubt. Javier Cortez was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years, depending on the degree of their participation and their cooperation with authorities. The assets that they had acquired with stolen money, houses, cars, bank accounts, business interests, were seized and eventually returned to the agricultural cooperative, which was reformed under new leadership, which was made transparent and accountable. The families of Cortez's other victims, people who had been murdered or disappeared during his years in power, finally received answers about what had happened to them. Cold cases were reopened. Evidence that had been hidden or destroyed was reconstructed. Some cases were closed with confessions. Others were solved with forensic evidence that had been ignored in the originally corrupt investigations. When the final verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in applause. It was one of those rare moments when a court allowed emotion to supersede protocol. The judge, instead of gaveling to restore order and reprimand the spectators for their outburst, simply allowed the joy and relief to be expressed for several minutes. Lucia remained motionless, watching as Cortez was escorted from the courtroom by federal guards, seeing the expression of absolute shock on his face, as if he could not comprehend that someone like him, someone who had been above the law for so long, someone who had believed himself invincible, could finally be held accountable for his actions. It was then, in that moment of triumph, that Lucia understood something profound and transformative. She did not feel the satisfaction she had expected to feel. There was no triumph as she had imagined it over all these years. There was only a strange and quiet emptiness, because no sentence could bring her father back, no conviction could return the 19 years that her mother had lost searching for the truth, years that could have been spent in connection with her daughter, years that could have been lived fully instead of lived in the shadows of a terrible secret. No punishment could erase the damage that Cortez had caused, the lives destroyed, the dreams stolen, the potential cut short. But at least now the truth was recorded in the public record for eternity. At least now no one could deny what had happened. No one could claim that Hector Mendoza had been a criminal. He was vindicated completely. He was recognized as a martyr who had died trying to do what was right, who had died trying to expose corruption, who had died because he had the courage to confront powerful men and refused to compromise his integrity. Elena Mendoza was released from the hospital 3 weeks after the verdict. The doctors explained that her recovery would be a long process, that she would need intensive physical and speech therapy to regain most of her functions. The left side of her body was weakened from the stroke. Her speech was slow and careful, every word requiring effort. She would need a cane to walk, probably for the rest of her life. But when Elena looked at her daughter and saw her face, her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had been freed from a burden she had carried for nearly 2 decades. Finally, she whispered on that first night back in her home, and Lucia understood that the single word meant incomparably more than its simple definition. It meant 19 years of searching, finally completed. It meant the death of her husband, finally explained and avenged. It meant the end of an era of uncertainty and pain. It meant that her life could finally begin again, that she could finally rest, that she could finally stop looking backward and start looking forward. Lucia spent the next month in San Cristobal, leaving her cases in the hands of her associates in the capital. She spent her days helping her mother through the rehabilitation process, attending physical therapy sessions, helping Elena relearn how to move her left side with purpose. She spent her afternoons reading books to her mother, stories that Elena had loved when she was younger, classics and romances and mysteries. She spent her evenings walking slowly with her mother through their childhood home, remembering moments, rebuilding the bridges that time and pain had burned. She listened to Elena speak, slowly at first, then with increasing fluidity, about her years of searching for the truth. Elena talked about the nights of doubt, about the moments when she wanted to give up but couldn't allow herself to surrender. She talked about the detectives she had hired and fired, about the false leads that had wasted her time and her money, about the people who had refused to talk to her out of fear. She talked about the slow accumulation of evidence, the gradual building of a case, the realization that her daughter had become the weapon that could bring justice. One afternoon, while they rested in the backyard of their childhood home, sitting under the shade of the large mango tree that Hector had planted more than 30 years ago, a tree that had grown and thrived while he was gone, a tree that produced fruit every season without fail, Elena took her daughter's hand and said with a clarity in her voice that hadn't been there in the hospital, "Now you can leave. Now you can live your life without this burden that we have carried for so long. Now you can be free." "Will you come with me?" Lucia asked. "You can come live with me in the capital. I can take care of you. We can be together." Elena smiled but shook her head slowly. "No, my love. Let me stay here, in my home. Let me be close to the places where your father was happy. Let me be in the town where he was born, where I lived my best years. I am tired of wandering. I am ready to stay." So Lucia returned to the capital, but not alone in her heart. She maintained regular contact with her mother, traveling to San Cristobal every 2 months without fail. She spoke with Elena every Sunday by telephone, and they would share stories about the week, about who had visited Elena in the town, about how Elena was recovering more and more of her mobility thanks to relentless physical therapy. The neighbors had begun to recognize her around town again. The people who had once whispered about her obsessive search now saw her as a kind of heroine, the woman whose determination and her daughter's courage had finally brought a killer to justice. Elena recovered better than even the most optimistic therapists had predicted. They said it was because she finally had a reason to live, a purpose that had been completed, but also a future to live for. Lucia believed it was simply because Elena was the strongest woman she knew, stronger than any woman she had ever encountered in her entire life. Lucia's own life changed after that as well. She continued to work as a criminal defense attorney, but she completely changed the type of cases she accepted. She abandoned the high-profile cases that had allowed her to earn enough money to purchase luxury apartments and expensive automobiles. Instead, she began dedicating her time and her talents to cases that other lawyers considered too difficult, too risky, too lost. Cases of systemic corruption, cases involving unsolved crimes, cases of families who had been left without answers, families like her own who had suffered at the hands of powerful criminals who had never been held accountable. She became the lawyer that other lawyers called when the system seemed completely corrupt, when the truth seemed impossible to find, when justice seemed unreachable. She built a reputation not as a woman who worked for money or fame, but as a woman who worked because she believed that truth mattered and that justice was worth pursuing. She became a legend in legal circles throughout Mexico, a woman who had taken one of the most powerful politicians in the country and completely destroyed him legally and professionally. Her name became synonymous with relentless justice. But unlike her earlier years, now she worked without the rage that had driven her for 19 years. She worked with clear purpose, with calm determination, with the understanding that truth is its own reward, that justice is its own satisfaction. The last time Lucia visited her mother before everything changed again was on a Sunday afternoon in spring. The flowers in the garden were blooming. The weather was warm, but not oppressive. Elena was sitting in the patio of their childhood home, walking slowly with her cane, moving with purpose despite her physical limitations. Her hair, completely gray now, shone in the sunlight like silver. Her smile was the smile of a woman who had found peace, who had resolved the central mystery of her life, who had finally put her ghosts to rest. "Do you have news?" Elena asked, as she always did. She had developed a habit of asking if Lucia had news about the cases she was working on, about the justice she was pursuing. "Javier Cortez died in prison," Lucia said simply. "A heart attack. The guards say it was fast. That